The morning I found out my sister had left me everything, I was standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe that had seen better days, drinking coffee that had gone cold, and thinking about whether I needed to call the plumber again about the bathroom sink. That was my life at 63, practical, quiet, a little worn around the edges, just like that bathrobe. My sister Josephine had been sick for 2 years. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't negotiate. She was 4 years older than me, and we had been close in the way that sisters who've survived difficult childhoods tend to be, not always talking, not always agreeing, but always there. She had never married. Never wanted to, she used to say. She'd built a small empire instead, a chain of dry cleaning businesses across 3 counties in Ohio that she'd started with one location and a second-hand pressing machine back in 1987. By the time she died, she had 11 locations and a property portfolio she'd assembled piece by piece over 40 years. I knew she'd done well. I didn't know how well. The call came from her attorney on a Tuesday morning in late October. He was a measured, careful man named Mr. Aldridge, and he told me that Josephine had left the entirety of her estate to me, the businesses, the properties, the investment accounts, everything. He said a number. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically. My legs just stopped working. $4.2 million, plus the businesses which were valued separately. I sat there on the cold tile for a long time. Then I called my husband. His phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. I tried his office line at the architecture firm where he'd been a senior partner for 12 years. And his assistant, a young woman named Chelsea, told me he was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. I said it was urgent. She put me on hold for 3 minutes, and then she came back and said he'd call me when he was free. I remember feeling in that moment that something was slightly off. Not wrong exactly. Just off. My husband was not a man who let urgent calls from his wife sit. In 34 years of marriage, he had always called back within the hour. Always. I told myself it was nothing. I made fresh coffee. I called my daughter instead. My daughter answered on the first ring, which is how I know she loves me more than her father does, and that's not a joke anymore. I've just decided it's a fact I can live with. She screamed when I told her, the good kind of screaming. And then she cried, and I cried, and we talked for an hour about Josephine and what she'd built and what this meant. My daughter had always adored her aunt. Josephine used to take her to the dry cleaning plants when she was small and let her press handkerchiefs on the little demonstration machine. My daughter grew up thinking her aunt was the most competent woman alive. She was right. My husband called back at 4:15 in the afternoon, 7 hours after I'd tried to reach him. I told him about Josephine's estate. There was a pause, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then he said, "Wow, that's something. That's something." 34 years, that's what he said. I told myself he was tired. I told myself the partnership had been stressful lately, that there was a big commercial project in Cincinnati that had been giving him grief for months. I told myself a lot of things that autumn. Here's what I didn't let myself notice, that he started coming home later, that he began taking weekend site visits alone, that he bought a new phone and kept it face down on every surface in our house, that when I reached for his hand at the movies one Saturday in November, he moved it to his lap before I could close my fingers around his. I noticed all of it, I just didn't let myself know what I was seeing. That's a different thing. My sister had always said I was too patient. She said it the way some people say it as a compliment. "You're so patient, Barbara." But with Josephine, there was always a little edge in it, a slight tightening around the eyes. She didn't mean it as a compliment. She meant it as a warning. I understood that in February. That was when I drove to my husband's office unannounced. It was a Friday late morning. We'd had the first warm day of the year, one of those Ohio February days that tricks you into thinking spring is close. And I had bought a good lunch. Sandwiches from the Italian place he liked, cannoli, a bottle of sparkling water, and I thought I would surprise him. It had been a long winter. We hadn't been easy with each other. I thought maybe a lunch together, just the two of us, might put something back that had been slowly draining away. The firm was on the 4th floor of a glass building downtown. I'd been there dozens of times. I knew the receptionist, an older gentleman named Mr. Beaumont, who always commented on my coat. I waved to him and took the elevator up, carrying the paper bag from the restaurant, feeling almost lighthearted for the first time in months. The door to my husband's office was closed but not latched. I could hear his voice inside, low and unhurried, the way he talked when he wasn't on a work call. When he was relaxed, I pushed the door open. He was sitting behind his desk. Across from him in the chair that clients usually occupied was a woman I recognized. She had worked at the firm for years. She and my husband had collaborated on 3 or 4 projects that I could name off the top of my head. Projects I'd heard about at dinner tables, at firm holiday parties where I'd stood next to her and made small talk about nothing. They weren't doing anything. That's the thing people always want to know. They were just sitting there. But the way they looked at each other when I walked in, that split second before either of them rearranged their faces, told me everything I had been refusing to understand since October. My husband stood up. I looked at him. I looked at the bag in my hand. I thought about Josephine sitting across from me in her kitchen 2 years ago, telling me, "Be careful with your money, Barbara. Keep it separate. A woman should always have something that's only hers." I said, very calmly, "I just came to bring you lunch." I set the bag on his desk, and then I walked out. I didn't cry in the elevator. I didn't cry in the parking garage. I drove home, went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and thought for a very long time. I thought about the accounts. My husband had managed our finances for most of our marriage. Not because I couldn't. I ran a household. I balanced our books. I knew exactly what we spent. But because it had been easier early on to let him handle the investments. Over time, that had become the arrangement, the way things become arrangements, without anyone consciously deciding. He managed the money. I managed everything else. I thought about what Josephine had left me. Mr. Aldridge had advised me, very carefully, at our first meeting, to keep the inherited assets in accounts solely in my name. Under Ohio law, inheritance remains separate property in a divorce as long as it isn't commingled with marital assets. He said gently, the way attorneys say things they want you to hear without seeming to assume anything. I had followed his advice. I don't know exactly why. Maybe somewhere I had already known. I did not confront my husband that night. I made dinner. I asked about the Cincinnati project. I listened to him talk. The next morning, I called a divorce attorney, then I called a forensic accountant. The forensic accountant was a matter-of-fact woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and asked very good questions. She told me that examining 34 years of joint finances would take some time, but that she'd seen cases like mine before and that I should expect to find things I wasn't going to like. She was right about that, too. Over the following months, she and my attorney began building a picture. It took time because my husband was clever and because the money had moved in ways designed to be difficult to trace. But the accounts didn't lie. They just required patience. The kind of patience I had, apparently, been training for my entire life. What emerged was this. For approximately 6 years, my husband had been systematically diverting money from our joint accounts. Small amounts at first moved to accounts I didn't know existed. Then, as his confidence grew, larger transfers, some routed through a shell LLC he had established using our home address without my knowledge. The total amount he had redirected over those 6 years came to somewhere in the range of $380,000. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. Because I sat with it for a very long time. He had been siphoning our shared savings, money I had contributed to over 34 years, the money from the sale of our first house, the proceeds of an investment account my own parents had started for us as a wedding gift. And he had been moving it, setting it aside, building a fund. My attorney explained to me, very quietly, what she believed he had been planning, to leave the marriage with enough of a financial cushion that the division of our marital assets would hurt him less. He had, by her read of the evidence, been preparing his exit for years. She said he had probably anticipated that I would consult an attorney, but had assumed the forensic analysis would be superficial. He had not anticipated Josephine. He had not anticipated that I would come into an inheritance substantial enough to make his control of our finances meaningless to me. He had not anticipated that my own attorney would recommend a forensic accountant before I had given him any reason to worry. He had not anticipated that the quiet, patient wife who had made his dinners and managed his household and smiled beside him at 34 Christmas parties would turn out to have very good advisors and a great deal of time. I filed for divorce in April. He did not take it graciously. There was a period of several weeks during which he seemed to believe that if he simply denied enough things, I would become confused or exhausted and back down. He called me irrational. He said I had misunderstood what I'd seen at his office. He said the finances were complicated and that I didn't have the full picture. I had the full picture. My forensic accountant had put it together very thoroughly, and it ran to 112 pages. My son, who is 31 and has his father's eyes, and, I was sorry to discover, a fair amount of his father's sense of loyalty to himself, called me and asked if I had really thought this through. He said his father had given a lot to our family. He said divorce at my age seemed like a drastic step. He said maybe a counselor. I told him that I appreciated his concern and that I had thought it through very carefully. My daughter called me after that conversation and said, with characteristic directness, "Tell me you're not letting him talk you out of it." I said I was not. She said, "Good." And then she said she was coming to stay with me for a week, and she did, and those were some of the best days I'd had in years. We went through Josephine's papers together, sorting photographs and old letters. We cooked too much food. We sat on the back porch in the evenings and talked about things I hadn't talked about in a long time. The divorce was finalized in September, 11 months after I sat on the kitchen floor with my legs failing me. The marital assets were divided per Ohio law. The hidden accounts, once my attorney filed the motion for dissipation of marital assets and the forensic evidence was presented, were counted as part of his share. He received less than he had planned for, considerably less, and he was made to return the amounts diverted to me with interest. His attorney tried to argue. Our judge was a woman who had been on the family court bench for 22 years and had seen every argument in the book. She was not impressed. There was a moment, sitting in that courtroom, when I looked across at my husband of 34 years. He looked diminished somehow. Not physically. He was still the same man I had watched walk across a room toward me in 1990 and thought, there he is. But something that I had taken for solidity had turned out to be performance. The competence, the control, the sense of a man who had everything organized. He had been performing it, I think, for longer than either of us had understood. I walked out of that courthouse into September sunshine with my attorney beside me and felt something I cannot describe very precisely except to say it was not triumph. It was quieter than triumph. It was the feeling of taking a step you've been afraid to take and finding solid ground beneath your foot. Josephine's estate, handled by Mr. Aldridge and untouched throughout the divorce proceedings, was mine. The joint assets, fairly divided, were mine. And I had 34 years of understanding how to run a household and balance accounts and manage complexity, which turned out to be worth considerably more than I had been led to believe. I kept the house. My husband moved into an apartment. The woman from his office, I heard through mutual acquaintances, had already moved on to someone else by the time the divorce was final. This did not appear to surprise anyone who knew her. My son and I have reached an uneasy peace. He calls more often now. I think seeing the evidence, which my attorney presented in full during proceedings he attended, changed something for him. Or maybe he just grew up a little. I love him. I also do not make excuses for him, which is a position I arrived at slowly and with some difficulty and intend to maintain. My daughter and her family came for Christmas. We had 15 people in Josephine's kitchen. I've kept her house, the one she bought in 1998 in a small town outside Columbus, and I've started spending weekends there. And I made Josephine's macaroni and cheese, the recipe she never wrote down but that I finally reconstructed from memory. And we were loud and warm and at the table long after the food was gone. I am 64 years old. I live on my own for the first time in my adult life, which is stranger than I expected and more peaceful than I feared. I take a yoga class on Tuesday mornings. I am learning, slowly, how to invest the money Josephine left me in ways she would have approved of, carefully, with good advisors, and with my name on everything. I think about Josephine often. The businesses are being managed now by a general manager she hired years ago, a competent woman who has no interest in leaving, and I am letting her do her job while I learn what I need to learn. Josephine always said that the smartest thing you can do with a business you didn't build is to find the person who understands it and stay out of their way until you understand it yourself. She was almost always right. On a shelf in her kitchen, there is a framed needlepoint that her mother, our mother, made sometime in the 1970s. It says, "A woman who knows her own worth cannot be cheated for long." I don't know where our mother found that saying. I don't know if she made it up. But I look at it every weekend when I'm in that kitchen, and I think about the sister who kept it on her shelf for 40 years and left me everything she had, and I think she was trying, in the only way she knew how, to tell me what to do when the time came. I listened, Josephine. Late, but I listened.